When our ancestors pictured the United States of America, they thought of citizens with great opportunity, freedom, and hope. If a person were to characterize America today, they would most likely discuss the multi-billion-dollar deficit, the inability of Republicans and Democrats to work together in government, and the social division resulting from conservative and liberal views. There is no doubt that our system of democracy trumps all other types of governments. However, the American spirit has been long lost since the days of our ancestors. From the 1960s to the 2000s, America has been sharply declining due to economic issues such as inflation and unemployment, political issues with dishonest leaders and corruption, and social unrest due to movements and wars. America's decline started in the 1960s, beginning with an economic downturn, age of violence toward the government, and the division of American people over civil rights. The U.S. began the decade with poor economy with unemployment at 5.8%. President Johnson launched new programs such as Medicare, food stamps, and many education initiatives, causing federal income to increase dramatically. As American presence grew in Vietnam, military spending readily increased. Spending on the government-affiliated programs in the Vietnam War, along with a failure to raise taxes, led to the acceleration of inflation. In addition, the 1960s displayed deep political unrest regarding civil rights. John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Here, he was trying to regain Texas votes he originally lost for supporting civil rights. 4.5 short years later, Martin Luther King Jr., the most significant of America's black civil rights activists, was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The assassinations of both JFK and MLK displayed the growing resentment in the Democratic and Republican parties. The economic and political unrest in the 1960s translated into social turmoil, where there was division among the American people. People trying to escape the harsh realities of a failing economy and a bloody war turned to the counterculture. The other half of Americans, who believed people who should face their problems head-on, looked down on these fringe jacket-wearing, drug-abusing people. With MLK electrifying the fight for equality among blacks and whites came an enormous division between supporters and detractors. As the decade came to a close, one could only hope the 70s would be an era of change. This was not the case.
The 1970s had more regress than progress due to a worsening economic state, a corrupt government, and violence due to differing views on the Vietnam War. The oil embargo placed on the West by the Arabs triggered gas prices to skyrocket, devastating the American economy. This led to stagflation, a period characterized by high inflation along with high unemployment. Stagflation would be responsible for gas prices rising from 35 cents in the beginning of the 70s to 90 cents in the end of the decade. Nixon's Watergate scandal of 1972 generated distrust in the American government amongst citizens and media. Days passed, the trial dragged on, and Nixon began to look more and more guilty. However, he never admitted to being the mastermind behind the scandal, and he resigned from office prior to impeachment. As Americans became skeptical of the U.S. government, the decline of the political system worsened. By the 1970s, were tired of fighting a war that, one, didn't seem relevant enough to be losing American lives, and two, had no promise of ending soon. People were split over the issue of whether we should end our involvement in Vietnam. These differing views eventually caused violence as seen in the Kent State Massacre, where students were killed for protesting the war. Again, people hoped that a new decade would bring a new wave of thinking. Unfortunately, matters only got worse. The U.S. continued its downward descent in the 1980s by plunging into an economic recession, producing more hostility between the government and the people, and introducing more social issues. There was a deep recession throughout 1982. According to the U.S. Department of State, business bankruptcies rose 50% from the previous year. Reagan made an executive decision to increase military spending, cut taxes, which made the federal budget deficit swell. From $74 million in 1980, federal budget deficit rose to $221 million in 1986. On Black Monday of October 1987, there was a major crash in the stock market, resulting from the rise in the federal budget. Furthermore, despite the embargo against selling weapons to Iran, Reagan approved of the secret exchange of American arms for the 7 U.S. hostages in 1985. Although Reagan felt it was his duty to bring those hostages home, dealing with the Iranian terrorists violated his campaign promises. On television, Reagan denied the operation had occurred, only to retract the statement a week later. President Ronald Reagan, the honorable, dependable face of America, represented disappointment in yet another American political leader. America was being further torn apart through social concerns during the 1980s, such as AIDS, abortion, and drug abuse. Pertaining to the AIDS crisis, there was hostility between homosexuals, heterosexuals, as the disease was named the gay plague. Resulting to abortion, there was a division between pro-life advocates and pro-choice advocates, and further widening the social rift, there were some that believed legalizing drugs would be beneficial for our country, while others believed in Nancy Reagan's motto, "Just say no."
America's decline continued with a poor economy and high inflation, dishonest leaders in government, and inequality amongst the population. The decade of the 90s brought the beginning of the Gulf War, which resulted in the spike in the price of oil and increased inflation. The next several years dealt with high unemployment, massive government budgetary deficit, and slow gross domestic product growth, affecting the U.S. until 1992. When officials investigated the Whitewater land deal, they turned to Monica Lewinsky, Clinton's former White House intern. She accidentally revealed she had an inappropriate relationship with President Clinton, which he attempted to deny. 7 minutes later, he admitted to having an affair with Miss Lewinsky. Though the House impeached him, the Democrat-controlled Senate voted against impeachment. Needless to say, Bill Clinton's scandal made Americans feel they would never be able to have trust in a political leader again. With all the progress the black population had made in America, the 1990s marks yet another pitfall in their movement. The median income of black families fell by 6% in the 1990s, setting back their goal of inequality. While the technology of the 90s had people looking towards the future, the U.S. was still dealing with problems from the past. From the 1960s to the 2000s, Americans had grown older, yet not wiser. The 2000s started off with zero net growth and the slowest rise in the economy yet. Based on information from News and Issues in the Economy, the recession of 2008 began with an $8 trillion in the housing bubble, a loss of 8.4 million jobs in the U.S. labor market, and banks withdrawing $160 billion from ultra-safe money market accounts. On November 20th, 2008, Dow hit its low of 7,552. September 11th, 2001 is a day that will forever live infamously in American history. After 4 planes were hijacked by Al-Qaeda members and crashed into New York City, the District of Columbia, and Pennsylvania, President George W. Bush felt there was no other option but to infringe war on Afghanistan and Iraq, beginning the decade-long war on terrorism. Members of the left critique Bush for this decision, saying the conflict could have been resolved without war. However, those from the right commend Bush for this decision, recognizing the importance of exerting American dominance over the Middle Eastern terrorists. These conflicting views have driven the Democratic and Republican parties further away from each other than ever before in history. Parties also clashed when it came to fixing the economy. Each having a different plan of attack, there is more aggression between the Democrats and Republicans now than ever. Being on the brink of an economic depression, the quality of living plummeted. With the stress of not being able to provide for a family, divorce rates were at an all-time high. Suicide rates skyrocketed. From the 1960s to the 2000s, the U.S. was still struggling with the same problems that have only gotten worse as time has moved on. While we still live in America the Beautiful, we do not live in America the Better. In the past 40 years, the United States economy has suffered to the brink of a depression. The bridge of trust between the government and the people has been permanently severed due to consistently dishonest leaders. And the American people are pinned against each other from each corner of the rink due to social issues. A country divided against itself will not stand. If there is any hope of turning this ship around, the U.S. needs a stimulated economy, leaders who have the country's best interests at heart, and people willing to forget their differences and unite as one.